You're listening to the ILEG radio show with Dr. Paul F.J. Arañas, broadcasting live on radio.ileducationgroup.org and eyeonglobalpolitics.com.
It's 2:48 a.m. here on the West Coast. The New York Times has just posted a couple of days ago that Russian trade appears to have largely bounced back to where it was before the invasion of Ukraine, as the country's neighbors and allies step up to fill the gaps left by Western restrictions. So basically, they're saying that the sanctions don't work. And what's interesting about that is the level of certitude from the U.S., the Biden administration, and European countries of the devastating impact of the first round of sanctions. If you remember, Biden said if he crosses that line into Ukrainian territory, then the whole world is going to come down on Russia. Devastating consequences. And they talked about SWIFT, and they talked about how the financial markets, and they just wanted to see Russians in bread lines. And yeah, there's some inconveniences. Some companies left, but all in all is normal, and trade has bounced back. The ruble bounced back. And you have to ask yourself, for somebody that claims to be the world leader and the world policeman, what happens to their credibility when they say something's going to happen, that this devastating impact, a punishment, and nothing happens? And so the EU is on the 10th round of sanctions. You would think that after the first round, if it was so devastating, you wouldn't need 10 rounds. It gets ridiculous after a while, and maybe they should just stop with the sanctions and butt out ski. And start advocating for peace. Start promoting dialogue and a ceasefire instead of acting like the big tough guys. You know, Russia is not Afghanistan, and it's not Guatemala. Nothing against Guatemala and Afghanistan. They're just smaller, not as powerful, weak countries, militarily, economically, impoverished countries. And Russia's a superpower. So, like Zelensky putting on a big show of his bravado, so too the West, in its decline, continues to put on a big show of bravado. And maybe we should just learn to communicate and to dialogue instead of to threaten. I think that's the real problem. What do you think? I think the real problem is that the West is so used to dominating the weak, the impoverished countries that they colonialized, that they've invaded, and they don't know how to treat people on an equal level. And I think if you go back in time and you read the statements that have been given over and over by Vladimir Putin and other leaders in Russia, they all along just wanted to be treated as equals with dignity and have a dialogue and common mutual security interests, and they were discarded and disregarded time and time again, and until war breaks out. And so we need to maybe teach our leaders how to communicate, because they don't know how to communicate in a civil way without threatening force, without threatening punishment. They have to learn that they're no longer the top dog in the world, that the world is a multipolar world.
You're listening to the ILEG radio show with Dr. Paul F.J. Arañas, broadcasting live on radio.ileducationgroup.org and eyeonglobalpolitics.com.
Now, the Olympics are coming up in another year, 2024 in Paris, and there's a lot of Western countries that are clamoring to have Russian and Belarusian athletes banned from the Olympics. Can you imagine that? Banning an entire country, two countries, from competing in the Olympics? The Polish sports minister said, allowing athletes from Russia and Belarus to compete at the Paris Olympics could lead to a large-scale boycott and render the games pointless. He said pointless. And Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia accused the IOC, that's the International Olympic Committee, of advancing special exemptions allowing Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete at the Games. In a joint statement, sports ministers from the four nations said such actions would enable sport to be used to legitimize and distract attention from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Do you know how ridiculous this is? They have a grievance against Russia, against a war going on in Ukraine, and they're going to take it out on athletes. The United States is also backing this, but the United Nations, the International Human Rights Body, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, "We urge the IOC to adopt a decision that in that direction and go further, ensuring that non-discrimination of any athlete on the basis of their nationality. It is a human rights violation to discriminate against athletes, against anybody on the basis of their nationality. These athletes have nothing to do with their government's policy or the war in Ukraine, just because they hold citizenship any more than an American basketball player or swimmer had something to do with the Iraq War or the Vietnam War. Should American athletes be banned, or the French athletes be banned for their foreign policy adventurism, military adventurisms, or neo-colonial actions in Africa or New Caledonia? It's a human rights crime to ban athletes based on nationality, and the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the UN is saying so. The thing is that this comes from a long history of Russophobia. It's not just about the war, which the media has completely left the Western public without any context. But this anti-Russian sentiment that results in wanting to ban athletes goes back centuries, goes back decades and centuries. And you can see it in the way they react now against ordinary civilians, ordinary citizens, whether it be musicians, entertainers, in a way that they don't react when another country has a foreign policy decision that they don't like, or of course their own countries, United States and European countries, when they have military policies or foreign policies that many others don't like. They never have their citizens targeted, and if they did, they would be outraged. But there's a double standard, so we have to keep an eye on this one, because this is such a can you imagine training all your life to be in the Olympics? And it's bad enough that they didn't allow Russian athletes to fly their flag and to hear the national anthem in the Olympics, which was completely ridiculous. It's just trying to humiliate Russia, and this has been going on for years. It's out of proportion to any doping scandal. United States is doped. European countries have been caught doping. Lance Armstrong doped. It's not right, but you don't go out of your way to try to humiliate an entire country. And that's exactly what they've always tried to do. And they did that where you have to fly a neutral flag, a white flag, can't hear your anthem. And, sooner or later, a powerful country like Russia is going to say, I've had it with you. We don't want anything to do with you. We'll have our own games. We'll have our games with China and India and Africa. Because, just your Russophobia, that is based on a fear of losing the grip on your hegemonic power, we don't want to deal with it anymore, they'll say. And so they'll just break free, and that's what's happened. That's what's happening right now. There are no relations between Russia and the West. And there's a lot to this conflict. We talk about it a lot on the ILEG radio show, and there's a lot that's never said in the Western media. And the causes for this that go back 8 years and before that. But, it's really sad when countries that talk about human rights and freedom and democracy, and then they go after innocent athletes and entertainers in order to get back at a country that they're unable to get back at. And that's what this really kind of all revolves around. The fact that they put sanctions on Russia, and if those sanctions worked, then they wouldn't target the athletes because they say, okay, we're going to crush their economy. But they couldn't crush their economy. Russia just smiled and walked right around their sanctions. And so they're just looking for low-hanging fruit right now. And it's really sad because it's undemocratic and it's against the values of any human rights institution, any human rights document on the international level that we have. And it's really just quite sad that the Western countries, the United States and the European Union, have stooped to such a low level.
You're listening to the ILEG radio show with Dr. Paul F.J. Arañas, broadcasting live on radio.ileducationgroup.org and ionglobalpolitics.com.